Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. I've always been the kind of person who doesn't mind being alone at night. Most of my friends think it's weird, but to me, there's something calming about the silence, the quiet streets, and the cool, crisp air that you only get in the dead of night. I don't know. It's like the world feels empty, like it's just me and the night. I'm not afraid of the dark or of being alone in a city that never sleeps. In fact, I kind of like it. But that night, it felt different. It was around 1 a.m., a time I'd usually be heading home from my late shift at the diner. It was a small, divey place near downtown Los Angeles, and we usually had a steady flow of customers even late into the night. But tonight, it was quieter than usual. The last few patrons had filtered out, the door chiming behind them, leaving me with nothing but the soft hum of the fridge and the clink of silverware. I didn't mind, though. I liked the solitude. I cleaned up the counter, wiped down the tables, and started making my way out the door when I realized I'd missed the last train home. My apartment was about 30 minutes away, so I didn't have a choice. I'd have to take the bus. I didn't like the bus at night. There was something about it, the flickering lights, the hum of the engine, the way the seats always smelled faintly of stale coffee and sweat, that made me uneasy. But tonight, there was no other option. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, taking in the cool air and the quiet of the city around me. It felt almost like the calm before a storm. The bus stop was just around the corner. As I made my way there, I noticed how eerily still everything felt. The streets were empty. No cars, no people, just a few stray papers blowing across the sidewalk. I checked my watch. 1:15 a.m. I was starting to wonder if the bus was even running at this hour. But sure enough, just as I was about to turn around, I heard the familiar rumble of the engine. The bus pulled up to the stop with a hiss of its air brakes, and I climbed aboard. The driver didn't acknowledge me, just nodded as I swiped my card and made my way down the aisle. The bus was nearly empty. A couple of tired-looking people sat near the front, a few more scattered in the middle. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, flickering here and there. There was a slight smell of something metallic in the air, like old coins or rust. But again, I didn't think much of it. It was just the bus. I took a seat near the window, feeling the cool glass against my cheek as I leaned my head back. The city lights blurred as the bus pulled away, the rhythm of the wheels against the pavement lulling me into a strange sense of calm. The driver made a few stops, picking up a couple more passengers, but soon the bus started to empty out. It wasn't unusual. Most people don't take the bus this late at night. I glanced around every now and then, watching the occasional streetlight flicker past. I wasn't really paying attention when I noticed that the bus was nearly empty. Just a few people left, and the night seemed to grow quieter as the bus hummed down the street. Then I saw him. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, he wasn't the only person left on the bus at that point. But there was something about the way he sat there in the back row that didn't sit right with me. He was hunched over, his face hidden in shadow. I couldn't tell if he was asleep or just really still. I tried to ignore him. After all, it was late and people get tired, right? But even though I wasn't looking directly at him, I could feel his presence in the air. It was like the space between us had grown thicker. His stillness, his silence began to feel unnatural, like he wasn't just a passenger, but something else entirely. I shifted in my seat, glancing out the window again, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I could feel his eyes on me, even from across the bus. I couldn't bring myself to look back, but I could sense it. That intense gaze, like someone watching you when you aren't looking. The bus rumbled along, and I kept my focus on the world outside. But then the stops started to dwindle. One by one, the few remaining passengers left. The bus grew emptier and emptier, and my sense of unease only grew stronger. It was just me and him now, the man in the back. The bus seemed to slow down at every turn, the engine groaning slightly as the bus made its way through the quieter streets. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just overthinking it. But it felt like the bus had become a cage, and we were the only two animals inside. I tried not to look back, tried to keep my eyes straight ahead, but it was impossible not to feel his presence. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I couldn't explain why, but something about him didn't seem right. The bus slowed for another stop, and I caught myself holding my breath, hoping that maybe he would get off. But no, he didn't move. He just stayed there, staring straight ahead. The silence between us was suffocating. I couldn't stand it anymore. I glanced back at him. His eyes, those eyes, locked onto mine. They were wide open, and his expression was vacant. Empty. Empty. I couldn't read it. His face was pale, almost sickly. His lips were barely parted, but there was no expression, no emotion, just a blankness that made my skin crawl. I quickly looked away, my heart racing in my chest. I told myself it was nothing. I was just tired. But then the bus hit a bump, and I felt it. The strange shift in the air. I heard the subtle creak of his seat as he moved. He wasn't just sitting there anymore. No, now he was shifting. And the movement was slow, deliberate, like he was preparing to get up. I tried to calm my breathing, but my body refused to listen. It was like my instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get off the bus, to run. The bus came to a halt at my stop. My stop. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly stood up, not even looking back to see if he was still there. I just needed to get off. I needed to leave. But as I reached for the door, I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps behind me. Behind me. I barely waited for the doors to open before I stepped out onto the cold pavement. The night air hit me like a slap in the face, crisp and sharp, making me shiver. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, my eyes darting to the street, looking for any signs of life. There was no one else around. Just the soft hum of the bus pulling away, the sound of my footsteps on the sidewalk, and the quiet rustling of leaves in the breeze. For a moment, I was relieved. I had made it off the bus. Everything was fine. But then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't alone. The man who had been sitting in the back of the bus, the one who hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, the one whose presence I couldn't shake, was now standing at the edge of the bus stop, just far enough to be out of my immediate sight. When I turned the corner, I noticed his silhouette following me, moving at a slow, deliberate pace. He didn't rush. He just walked like he had all the time in the world. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just heading in the same direction. Maybe it was a coincidence. But my gut told me otherwise. My footsteps quickened. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose him in the winding roads of the city. The night was so quiet now, the streets empty except for the sound of my shoes against the concrete. I glanced over my shoulder. He was still there. About a block behind me, just far enough to make me uneasy, but close enough that I could see his shadow stretching on the sidewalk. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe he lived around here. But the further I walked, the more the feeling of being watched crawled under my skin. Every time I turned a corner, I looked back, and there he was, always just far enough behind me to make it impossible to confirm that he was following me. But I knew. The cold started to bite into my skin as the wind picked up, sending a chill down my spine. I reached the intersection and slowed, trying to gather my thoughts. Was I being paranoid? Maybe I was just too tired from the long night. But no, something wasn't right. The way he walked, The way he was always just out of sight, like he knew exactly how much distance to keep so I wouldn't confront him. It was as if he was playing a game. A silent game. I stopped at the corner of a street, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear the soft rhythm of his footsteps getting closer, echoing against the empty buildings. Then, it happened. He was right behind me. Before I had time to react, I felt it. His hand, cold and firm, suddenly gripping my wrist. My breath caught in my throat, a scream dying on my lips as I whipped around to face him. His eyes were wide open, wide and staring, the same vacant, unsettling expression I had seen on the bus. He wasn't smiling, wasn't saying anything. He just stood there, holding my wrist so tightly I could feel my pulse thumping against his palm. I tried to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His eyes were enough to paralyze me with fear. I tugged harder, my other hand reaching for his, but it was like trying to move a steel beam. "Let go of me," I gasped, my voice trembling. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I knew I couldn't stay here with him. Not like this. He didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his fingers digging into my skin, pulling me back toward him. Something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let him drag me anywhere. Not if I could help it. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I jerked my arm back, pushing against his chest with my other hand, trying to break free. For a moment, I thought he would overpower me, but then, by some miracle, his grip loosened just enough for me to tear my arm free. Without hesitation, I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just ran. The sound of my pounding feet echoed in my ears as I rounded another corner, my body moving on pure adrenaline. The streets blurred around me, but I didn't care. I couldn't let him catch me. I couldn't let him... But then I heard it. His footsteps, slow and steady, just like before. He was still following me, always too close for comfort, just enough to keep my heart racing, my mind spiraling into panic. He was faster than I thought. I pushed myself harder, my breath ragged, my legs aching from the effort. The night air seemed to freeze in my lungs, but I didn't stop. I was almost there, just a little further, just a little bit more. I spotted a convenience store up ahead, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly in the night. I aimed for it, hoping the doors would be open, hoping I could get inside and lock myself away from him. I burst through the door, the bell above it jingling loudly as I staggered in, gasping for breath. The clerk behind the counter looked up in shock, his eyes widening when he saw me, disheveled and panting. "Are you okay?" The clerk's voice trembled, his eyes wide with concern as he glanced at the door, likely noticing my frantic expression. But I couldn't answer him right away. I couldn't form a coherent thought, let alone speak. I pulled out my phone from my pocket with shaking hands, my fingers slick with sweat, pressing the nines with urgency, dialing 911 as quickly as I could. The ringing tone felt like it lasted forever, but after just 2 rings, the voice on the other end picked up, sounding too calm in comparison to the panic rising in my chest. "911, what's your emergency?" I tried to speak, but for a moment, nothing came out. I was choking on the fear that had locked up my throat, unable to form words. I could feel my legs trembling beneath me, the adrenaline from running still coursing through my body. It took every ounce of willpower to force the words out. "There's a man," I gasped. "He's been following me. I think he's going to hurt me. He grabbed my wrist." My voice cracked at the last part, and I felt the tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, though I tried to force them back. The operator's voice remained steady, which, in some strange way, only made the situation feel even more real. "Okay, ma'am, I need you to stay on the line with me. Can you tell me your location?" I glanced around the store and told them the address. The operator didn't waste time. "We've got officers on the way, ma'am. Stay inside the store. Do not leave until the authorities arrive." I nodded, though I knew she couldn't see me. My hand trembled as I gripped the phone, my mind racing with thoughts of him. The way he had watched me on the bus, the unsettling silence, the way he had followed me for so long. What did he want? I couldn't think about that now. I couldn't focus on anything but staying inside the store, keeping my back against the door, and waiting for help to arrive. As I stood there, trying to force myself to breathe slowly, I glanced up at the clerk again. He was still watching me with a mixture of concern and confusion. I could see that he was debating whether to step closer, but he didn't. He just watched me, unsure of what to do, too. I don't know if he's gone, I whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make him reappear. The operator's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. I need you to stay calm, ma'am. Officers will be there shortly. Can you still see the man outside? I stared at the street through the glass door, but the shadows were too deep now, the light from the store too dim to see clearly. For a brief moment, I thought maybe he had disappeared. Maybe he had given up. But then I saw him. He was standing across the street, just at the edge of the shadows, just barely visible in the dim light of the street lamp. His figure was stiff, rigid, and unmoving, but I could feel him watching me. It was the same feeling I had on the bus, the unnerving, predatory awareness of being seen. His eyes were locked onto the store, and I had no doubt he was aware of me inside. I gasped, stepping back from the door, my back pressing harder against the glass. Ma'am, do you see him? The operator's voice was firm, but I could hear the urgency in her tone now. Yes, I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. He's out there. He's standing across the street, looking right at me. Do not engage with him, ma'am. Stay where you are. The officers are just a few minutes away. Keep your distance. I nodded again, even though I wasn't sure if I was still capable of thinking clearly. The air around me felt suffocating, like everything was pressing in, and the sound of my own breathing seemed to echo in my ears. Finally, after what felt like forever, I heard the familiar wail of police sirens in the distance. The relief that surged through me was almost overwhelming, but I couldn't let my guard down just yet. I watched as the flashing lights lit up the street, and soon the patrol cars came into view, pulling up to the curb. Officers poured out of the vehicles, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they moved toward the man. The officers approached him cautiously. They didn't let him get away. Ma'am, one of the officers said, his voice muffled through the door as he looked inside at me. Are you all right? Are you the one who called? I nodded, still too shaken to speak. The officer turned to his partner, and they started leading the man away. But I kept watching. I couldn't help it. As they loaded him into the back of the squad car, I saw his eyes, still wide, still vacant, still locked on me. There was no emotion there, no anger, no remorse, just the same disturbing blankness. I felt my stomach churn. Another officer walked toward the store, his footsteps sharp against the pavement. He's been flagged before, the officer said to me quietly, his voice low, but I could hear the grim recognition in his words. We've got a record on this guy. Assaults. Stalking. He's been involved in similar incidents. They said they would keep an eye on him, but something told me that even with the police on his tail, I'd never feel truly safe again. It wasn't supposed to be like this. My name is Ashley. I'm a graphic designer living in downtown Los Angeles. I've always loved the buzz of the city, the noise, the energy, but after months of nonstop work, I realized I needed a break. I needed peace. Something quiet, where I could just get away from everything. One night, I was scrolling through Airbnb, looking for a place to escape for a few days. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a little cabin in the woods, something isolated. The listing caught my eye immediately. A small, rustic cabin located in Northern California, surrounded by trees, no neighbors, and far away from the noise of the city. It seemed perfect. The description said it was rustic and charming, a little old but with basic comforts. It looked like it would offer exactly what I needed: quiet, solitude, and a break from all the chaos of my life. I didn't hesitate. I booked it. The drive up was longer than I anticipated. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already late afternoon. The sun was hanging low, casting long shadows across the narrow road. The closer I got, the more the surroundings changed. The dense forest closed in around me, the trees tall and dark, almost suffocating. The air had a cool, earthy smell, with the scent of pine and wet soil, like the forest had been soaking up the rain all day. As I turned down a narrow gravel road that led to the cabin, I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease. This is what I needed, I thought. But when the cabin came into view, I felt an odd shiver run through me. It was small, a bit run down, nestled right in the heart of the forest. The windows were dusty, the paint peeling off the old wooden frame. I stood there for a moment, the car engine still running, watching the house. There was something about it that made my skin crawl. It wasn't like any place I had stayed before. I couldn't put my finger on why it felt wrong. I shook off the thought. It's just an old cabin, that's all. It's been empty for a while. It's fine. I grabbed my things from the trunk of my car and slowly walked up the steps to the porch. The wooden planks creaked beneath my feet, the sound echoing in the silence. The door was unlocked, and I pushed it open with a bit of effort, the hinges squeaking loudly. Inside, the air was thick, stale, the kind of air you get when a place has been abandoned for a while. The floors were old and scratched, the walls covered in faint stains and marks. There was no sense of warmth or welcome here, just emptiness. A single dim light bulb flickered overhead, casting strange shadows along the walls. I took a slow breath and closed the door behind me, taking in the room. The living room was simple: an old couch with fraying cushions, a coffee table with chipped corners, a small bookshelf stuffed with old paperbacks. The furniture was arranged haphazardly, like the previous guests hadn't bothered to clean up. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, except for a few places where it had clearly been disturbed. But what really caught my eye was the room at the far end of the house. It was tucked away at the back, down a narrow hallway that led to a door that was barely cracked open. I hadn't noticed it in the listing photos, and it made me curious. It wasn't part of the main living space, almost like it was a forgotten corner of the house. I debated going in, but it felt wrong, like something was pulling me to that room. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer and peeked inside. The room was dark. There were only a few rays of sunlight filtering in through the dusty window, illuminating small floating particles in the air. The furniture inside was sparse: a small bed with a faded quilt, an old dresser with peeling paint, and a chair in the corner that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The air felt different in there, colder, as if it had been sealed off from the rest of the house for a long time. I lingered in the doorway for a moment longer, my heartbeat quickening. There was something about the room that unnerved me. It was the feeling that I was being watched, even though there was no one there. I quickly stepped back, closed the door, and tried to shake off the feeling. It's just an old cabin, I told myself. Nothing weird is going to happen. I decided to explore the rest of the house. The kitchen was simple, with a small stove, a sink, and a table by the window. The bathroom was nothing special, just a small tub and a cracked mirror. It was like stepping into a time capsule. Everything felt frozen in time, and it was starting to get to me. I went back into the living room and flopped onto the couch, taking a deep breath. The house eerily quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves outside. I kept my phone with me, feeling the need for some connection to the outside world, though the signal was weak at best. Still, I decided to turn on a podcast to keep my mind from wandering. As night approached, I made a quick dinner, a simple pasta, and sat at the table. The room grew darker as the sun set, and soon the only light came from a small lamp in the corner. The isolation was starting to weigh on me. I finished eating, cleaned up, and decided to try and get some sleep. I wasn't exhausted, but the quiet made me feel drained, like the stillness was sinking into my bones. I grabbed a blanket off the couch and crawled into the bed, pulling the thick quilt up around my shoulders. The house creaked and groaned as I lay there in the dark, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But then I heard it, a soft creaking sound, like someone walking across the floor. I froze, my body going rigid. The sound came from the hallway, from the direction of that strange room. The creaking wasn't random either. It was slow and deliberate. Step, creak, step, creak. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. There was no way anyone else was in the house. I was alone. My heart began to pound in my chest as I listened carefully. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was the house settling, old wood, old beams. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Minutes passed, but I couldn't relax. Every tiny creak in the house made my skin crawl. I stared into the darkness, waiting for something, anything to happen. But eventually my exhaustion caught up with me, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke up the next morning with a dull headache, my mind foggy from lack of sleep. It was light outside, but the house still felt cold. I got up and pulled on my jacket before stepping outside. The forest surrounding the cabin was quiet, unnervingly so. The trees were tall and thick, the ground covered in layers of fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head. The fresh air helped, but I still couldn't shake the lingering feeling that something was wrong here. After a long walk through the woods, I came back to the cabin and decided to spend the rest of the day inside. It felt safer that way. I was starting to feel more uneasy with every passing hour. By nightfall, I had a slight sense of dread hanging over me. The quiet had become deafening. Even with a podcast playing in the background, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was just before midnight when I heard it again, the creaking. This time it was louder, and it wasn't just in the hallway. It was closer, like someone was walking just outside my door. I held my breath, listening intently. I slowly reached for my flashlight and pushed the covers off, my legs trembling beneath me. I crept to the door, the light from my phone casting a faint glow over the room. I opened the door slowly, stepping into the hallway. There was nothing. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick, heavy, colder than it should have been. I stepped forward, the beam of the flashlight shaking in my hand. As I passed the door to that strange back room, I stopped. The door was now fully open. It hadn't been like that before. A shadow moved inside. Just a flicker, like someone had passed in front of the window. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there, staring at the open door, the silence around me thick and suffocating. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the light playing tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had seen something. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I wasn't about to walk into that room and find out. Instead, I backed away slowly, my flashlight trembling in my grip. I stood there in the hallway for what felt like hours, just waiting for something, anything, to happen. The house was eerily quiet. The only sound I could hear was the slow creaking of the floorboards under my feet, like the house was breathing in time with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me from the shadows. I decided I needed to get out of the house for a while. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out into the cold night air. The world outside was still, the trees whispering softly in the breeze. There was no one here. No one but me. I walked down the gravel path, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me like a second skin. The air was cool, crisp, but it didn't make me feel any better. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees swaying gently in the wind, their branches creaking like the house had earlier. By the time I returned to the cabin, it was well past midnight. I stood at the door for a moment, looking up at the dark windows. The cabin was just as quiet as I had left it. The creaks, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, it was all still there. I had to sleep. I had to at least try. So I went back inside, closed the door behind me, and locked it. But I couldn't sleep. The night passed in a blur. I tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that shadow flickering in the room, and every little sound, the groaning of the floorboards, the wind howling through the trees outside, made my skin crawl. By morning, I was exhausted. My head was pounding, my stomach was in knots. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I had to leave, but something stopped me. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the feeling that I needed to understand what was happening here. Maybe I was just too stubborn to admit that something was wrong. Either way, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Instead, I decided to stay, hoping the day would give me some clarity. That night, everything changed. The sun had set early, and the house was plunged back into darkness. I made a simple dinner, trying to keep my mind off the weirdness of the day, but even as I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the corners of the house, just out of sight. The creaks started again, faint at first, but then louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. This was something different. Someone was walking. I stood still, barely breathing, listening intently. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I could hear them. Step, creak, step, creak, getting closer. I turned toward the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. The door to the back room was now wide open. My breath hitched. I didn't want to go near it. I didn't want to find out what was making those sounds, but I couldn't stay in the living room either. The silence was too thick, too suffocating. I got up, my legs shaking beneath me. I moved toward the hallway, slowly, cautiously. The steps were louder now, coming from the direction of the back room. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I approached. The door was open. I could see the outline of the bed inside, the faint light from my flashlight reflecting off the dust-covered surfaces. But there was something else, too. A figure. It was standing by the window. A man, tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket. But his face, it was covered. Not by anything physical, but by a black void. His features were just missing. There was nothing there but darkness. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. My heart was racing, pounding in my ears. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just stood there, staring at this thing in the room. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, its presence so suffocating that I thought I might pass out. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. I blinked, and it was gone. The room was empty, silent. I felt the tension in the air release, but only slightly. The heaviness didn't lift. I had to get out. I couldn't stay another second in that house. I grabbed my things in a daze, heart still racing, and ran out the door. I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached a small town several miles away. I called the Airbnb owner, my hands shaking as I explained everything that had happened. She listened quietly, and when I was done, she sighed deeply. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but somber. "That cabin, it has a history. There had been a guest who stayed there years ago, and he died in his sleep from a heart attack. But there's something else. The house was abandoned for years after that. When it was reopened, guests started complaining about strange occurrences. I didn't know what to say. The dread I felt earlier, the shadow, the figure. It all made sense now, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. "I'm sorry," she repeated, her voice full of regret. "I should have told you before." I hung up the phone and just sat there, staring at the road ahead of me. I never thought I would experience something like this. I still don't know what it was, whether it was a ghost or something else entirely. All I know is that I'm never going back to that cabin. It was a quiet night in California, the kind where the air is still, heavy, and almost suffocating in its silence. I had just moved into my new apartment a couple of weeks ago, excited for the peace and solitude that living alone would bring. I wasn't used to the quiet yet, but I was getting there. It was my little sanctuary in the middle of everything. The noise of the city outside, the busy streets, the constant rush of people. My apartment was my refuge. Or at least, that's what I thought. I'm Ellie, by the way. Just turned 25, working from home. I have a job that keeps me at my desk for hours, and that's why I craved the silence in the evenings. To come home, close the door, and shut the world out. The world outside could be a mess, but within these four walls, I was safe, or so I believed. That night, the air in my apartment felt particularly dense. It wasn't hot, but it wasn't cool either. It was the kind of stillness that makes your skin prickle, as if the air itself is waiting for something. I didn't think much of it. After all, I'd been working late into the evening and I was tired. All I wanted to do was relax and get some sleep. I stretched out on the couch after finishing up a bit of work around 10:45 p.m. I was supposed to go to bed, but I kept putting it off. The apartment was bathed in dim light from a single lamp by the couch, the glow of the TV in front of me flickering softly. The air smelled faintly of dust, like it hadn't been disturbed in a while. Maybe I'd been so busy I hadn't noticed how the apartment felt, but tonight it felt strange. At some point I decided I was too tired to stay up any longer. I pulled the blanket off the couch and made my way toward the bedroom. The hallway between the living room and my bedroom was dark, save for the soft illumination coming from the TV in the other room. I hadn't bothered turning on the lights. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom for a moment, just looking around. The space was sparse but comfortable. My bed in the center of the room, a small dresser to one side, and a window that overlooked the street below. Nothing unusual. The room was still and quiet, too quiet. I've never been one to get nervous about silence, but tonight I felt something creeping in at the edges of my mind. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch. I shook it off. I'm just tired, I thought. It's fine. I slid under the covers, the softness of the sheets brushing against my skin. The coolness of the air inside the room made me shiver slightly. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, feeling a slight chill as it enveloped me. I was exhausted, my eyelids growing heavier by the second. I closed my eyes and tried to block out the world, but something about the stillness in the apartment kept gnawing at the back of my mind. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic buzzing. At first, I thought it was just a random noise. Maybe a car going by outside or something in the building. But as the sound persisted, I became aware of something unsettling. It wasn't coming from outside the apartment. It was coming from somewhere within the room. My mind started racing as I tried to locate it. It sounded like a phone vibrating, but there was nothing in the room with me that could be vibrating. I rolled over, reaching for my phone on the nightstand. It wasn't there. My phone was charging on the desk in the corner of the room, across from the bed. What the hell? I thought. I pulled myself up out of the bed, the cold hardwood floor sending a jolt through my body as my bare feet hit the surface. I stood in the center of the room, trying to figure out what the sound could be. But the buzzing persisted, louder now, more insistent. It was clear to me it was a phone vibrating, but it wasn't coming from the desk. It wasn't coming from anywhere on the surface. It was coming from beneath the bed. I froze. No way, I thought. There's no way. I stood there for a moment just staring at the bed. I wasn't even sure if I was hearing it correctly, but it kept going. It wasn't a trick of the mind. There was something beneath the bed vibrating softly, rhythmically, like a phone left on silent. I had no idea how it was possible, but it felt real. Too real. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, the air growing thick with an oppressive weight. I had to look. I had to know what it was. Maybe it was a misplaced phone, maybe a lost item I hadn't noticed earlier. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. Something normal, something explainable. I didn't know. I knelt down, carefully lowering myself to the floor. The buzzing grew louder, almost as if it was calling to me, pulling me in. My breathing was shallow as I peered under the bed. Nothing, just shadows. But then my eyes caught something, a movement, and that's when I saw him. I wish I could say that my brain immediately processed what I was seeing, but I didn't. I couldn't. It took a moment, maybe two, before I understood what I was looking at. There was a man, crouched beneath my bed, almost hidden by the darkness. His body was positioned in an unnatural way, as though he'd been there for a while. His face, half visible, was eerily calm. His eyes locked onto mine with such intensity that I felt my stomach drop. He wasn't just looking at me, he was watching me, waiting. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as panic set in. My mind raced, but my body didn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. He wasn't moving either, just crouching, staring. His face was pale, almost sickly. There was something strange about his expression, like he was amused by the fact that I had found him. Like this was all some twisted game. In his hand, he held something shiny. At first, I thought it was a knife, but I couldn't make out the details. The blade gleamed faintly in the darkness. It was the only source of light in the space beneath the bed. My brain was screaming at me to move, but I couldn't. I was glued to the spot, my body refusing to obey. His eyes never left mine. I could hear my heart thudding in my ears, the sound drowning everything else. The buzzing had stopped, but the silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, I snapped out of my trance, grabbed my phone, and ran. No thought, no hesitation, just instinct. I scrambled to my feet and bolted toward the door. My legs were shaky, my breath erratic as I grabbed the door handle. It felt like it took an eternity to turn, but somehow I managed. I threw the door open and slammed it behind me, locking it as quickly as I could. My hands were trembling so badly I almost couldn't get my phone out of my pocket. When I did, I dialed 911 in a panic, my mind scrambling to find the right words. "Please," I whispered, barely able to form a sentence. "Someone's in my apartment. I don't know who they are, but there's a man under my bed." The operator assured me that help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity. Every second felt like a lifetime. The silence outside the door was deafening, and I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath. But then, I heard the sound I dreaded most, the sound of glass shattering. The window. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. The police were coming, I hoped. I prayed they would get here before it was too late. The sirens finally grew louder, and I felt the tension break, if only for a moment. The rest of the night felt like a blur. When the police arrived, they found no sign of the man. There were no signs of forced entry, just a broken window. They told me it looked like he had escaped, but they couldn't find him. They said they would investigate further, but I never heard from them again. I moved out of that apartment the following week. I couldn't stay, and to this day I still don't know how he got in, how long he'd been watching me. I don't think I'll ever understand. I'll never forget that night. It's been years, but I can still feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck whenever I think about it. The night was like any other at first, quiet, predictable. But then, it all changed, and nothing would ever feel the same again. I was working the night shift at a small convenience store in California. It was one of those places that most people wouldn't even notice unless they needed something in a pinch. A 24-hour spot tucked away in a strip mall far from the city's bustle. The kind of place where if you weren't looking for it, you might drive right past. I was 23 at the time, working the shift from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. I liked the job because it was simple. Stock shelves, clean the counters, help customers if they needed something. Most of the time, it was peaceful. The night was always quiet, with very few customers coming in, especially after midnight. It was a lonely job, but it wasn't terrible. The store itself was small, dimly lit by buzzing fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally. The cold of the freezer section always made the air feel sharp and heavy, and the hum of the refrigerators was the only sound, besides the occasional shuffle of my own feet or the soft murmur of the radio I played to keep myself company. The fluorescent lights above gave the whole place a sickly yellow hue. It felt like time slowed down in there. The hours crawled by at a pace that made it easy to lose track of time. I had been working at this store for a couple of months, long enough to know the regulars. There was old Mrs. Parker, who came in at around 10 p.m. every night for her bag of chips and a soda. Then there was Tom, the trucker who stopped in for coffee before hitting the road. Sometimes a teenager would come in, maybe to grab a soda and a candy bar. But generally, the place stayed empty. I was just finishing up restocking the shelf of snacks when I glanced up at the clock. It was just past 2:30 in the morning. The store had been quiet for the last couple of hours, just the usual dead silence. That's when it happened. I heard it. The door chime. The faint ding of the bell that signaled someone had entered the store. I looked up, expecting to see a customer, maybe one of the regulars coming in for a late-night snack, but no one was there. The door was shut, the bell swaying gently, the only sign that anyone had been there. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. The wind outside had picked up a little earlier, and I figured maybe the door had been jostled, causing the bell to ring. But then I heard it again. Ding! I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The bell had rung again. This time, I knew I hadn't imagined it. I stood still for a second, listening. There was no other sound in the store. I looked around. The aisles were empty. The lights flickered overhead, and the cold air from the freezer section still hung in the air. It felt like the store had gotten quieter, like the hum of the fridges had softened. I walked over to the door, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just a draft, I told myself. It had to be. I opened the door and looked outside into the empty parking lot. No one was there. I squinted into the night, but there were no cars pulling into the lot. The few vehicles that had been there earlier in the night were still parked, unmoving. The night sky was overcast, the moon barely visible behind the clouds. It was so still, it felt like the world had stopped for a moment. I stepped back inside and took a deep breath. Maybe I was just overthinking it. It had been a long night, and I hadn't slept well the night before. It was easy for my mind to play tricks on me. But then, a few minutes later, I heard the chime again. Ding! This time, I couldn't ignore it. I looked up quickly, my pulse quickening. There was a man standing. I felt a chill wash over me. He hadn't made a sound when he entered. No door opening, no footsteps. He was just there, standing perfectly still, facing away from me. His back was to me, and the way he stood, it was strange, like he wasn't just waiting for something. He was watching. I tried to calm myself. It was late. I was tired. Maybe I was just seeing things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Hey, I called out. My voice came out quieter than I expected, a little shaky. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak louder. Can I help you? The man didn't move. I took a step forward. Sir? Still, no response. He just stood there, motionless. My heart was pounding now. This wasn't normal. I had worked this shift long enough to know when something was off, and this felt wrong. I walked a little closer, but I made sure to keep a safe distance. Are you okay? I asked, my voice quivering slightly. Can I get you anything? But the man didn't move. His posture was stiff, like he wasn't even breathing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was something off about him. I wasn't sure what to do. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide if I should walk over and try to help, or just go to the phone and call the cops. But then, he turned around. Slowly. His face wasn't what I expected. His skin was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His pupils were so dilated that they barely looked like eyes at all. His lips were thin, pressed tightly together like he was trying to hold something back. I froze. He stared at me, not blinking, not moving. For a moment, I couldn't move either. It was like time had stopped. Then he spoke. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't used it in days, maybe longer. "Open the register," he demanded, his hands sliding under his jacket. It happened so fast. I saw the outline of a gun in his hand before he pulled it out fully. It was pointed straight at me. My heart raced. I could feel the blood drain from my face. I had never been in a situation like this before. I stood there, frozen, as he took another step closer. His hand tightened around the gun. "Open it. Now!" I didn't know what to do. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. He took another step forward, and I stumbled back, knocking over a small display of gum. The noise seemed too loud in the silence of the store. "I said now," he growled. His voice was like gravel. "Don't make me shoot." I was shaking now. Every part of me rattled with fear. I couldn't think. My hands were trembling as I reached for the register. But my brain was working in overdrive. I had to do something. I couldn't just let him take whatever he wanted. I couldn't just hand over the money. Then my hand brushed against the counter. I remembered. The silent alarm. I'd never had to use it before. I didn't even know if it worked, but I pressed it anyway. For a moment, the man didn't notice. He was still focused on me, gun pointed straight at my chest, his eyes wild, panicked. I was still struggling to breathe when I heard it, the sound of sirens. Far off, but getting closer. The man's eyes widened. He cursed under his breath. Without warning, he lunged toward me, grabbing my wrist, yanking me toward him. I gasped, trying to pull away, but he was too strong. The gun was right there, inches from my face. I could feel the cold metal against my skin. I didn't know what to do. I fought back, pushing against him, struggling to break free. His grip was tight, like iron. But then I heard the police, the sound of sirens outside growing louder. He pulled away for a moment, his eyes flicking to the door. That's when the police rushed in. They didn't waste any time. Guns drawn, they stormed the store, shouting commands. The man tried to turn and run, but he was too slow. The officers were on him in an instant, bringing him down to the ground. It was over, just like that. The officers handcuffed him and pulled him to his feet. One of them asked if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. I was too shaken. I couldn't move. I just watched as they led the man out of the store in cuffs. They told me later that the man had robbed 2 other stores earlier that night. The same wild, desperate look in his eyes, the same cold, detached attitude. But the cops were quick. They got him. I was safe, but the fear didn't leave. It lingered. I still worked that same night shift. And every time the door chimes, every time I hear that ding sound, I freeze. I can't help it. I always wonder if that man will come back. But I'll be ready if he does. It was one of those quiet nights in California, the kind where the air feels dry and still, as if the world is holding its breath. I've lived in this house for a few years now, a small place in a suburban neighborhood. It's not much, just a modest 2-bedroom with old wood floors and a tiny backyard that's overrun with weeds and vines. But it's mine, and it's peaceful. I've always been someone who prefers peace and solitude. I'm in my late 20s, single, and like most nights, I was spending this one alone. My family had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving me to enjoy the quiet. The night started out like any other. I had just finished making dinner, nothing fancy, just a frozen pizza and some canned soda, and I was settled on the couch, flipping through my phone. The TV was on in the background, muted, with some random late-night show playing. I wasn't really watching it. I don't usually pay much attention to TV unless I'm really into something. I tend to get lost in my thoughts or the internet when I'm alone. The house had that familiar, comforting feeling. The air inside was warm, but the outside chill was starting to creep in through the cracks in the window frames. I could hear the wind picking up outside, pushing against the trees and the old wooden fence in my backyard. The sound of branches scraping against the house was faint, almost like a whisper. I don't know why I'm telling you this, but it's important to understand the setting. The house has always been a bit eerie at night. There's nothing particularly wrong with it, no paranormal stuff or anything like that. But sometimes, especially in the quiet hours after the sun sets, it feels like the house itself is just too quiet, like it's holding on to some kind of secret. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever lived in an old place, you know the feeling. The creaking floors, the little drafty corners where the cold air seems to always find its way in. It's that kind of place. So, there I was, sprawled out on the couch, mindlessly scrolling through my phone when I got up to grab a snack. That's when I heard the first sound. I wasn't paying much attention to the outside world, but when I heard it, I immediately froze. It was a faint noise at first, just a soft jiggling sound coming from the back of the house. It sounded like someone was trying to open the back door. At first, I thought it was the wind. Maybe it was just pushing against the door. That's what I told myself anyway. The back door to my house isn't the best. It's old, with a flimsy handle, and the frame sticks sometimes. But the more I listened, the more I realized this wasn't the wind. Someone was trying to open it. My stomach dropped. I stood there, frozen in place. My heart began to race. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe it was a stray animal, or even just the wind playing tricks on me. But the more I thought about it, the less it seemed like an explanation that made sense. The noise was too deliberate, too consistent. The door handle jiggled again. This time I could hear it more clearly, the rattle echoing through the quiet of the house. Whoever was out there wasn't just testing the handle, they were trying to get in. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe it was someone who had mistakenly come to the wrong house, but deep down I knew that wasn't the case. This felt different. It felt wrong. I told myself that I'd just go check the door, make sure it was locked, but I didn't want to be seen. So I moved as quietly as I could. I peeked through the small window in the door, trying to see anything that could explain the noise. The yard outside was dark, only illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights down the road. The trees swayed lightly in the wind, and the shadows shifted in the dark, but I couldn't see anyone. I strained my eyes, trying to make out any shapes in the darkness, but the yard was empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, feeling a little bit foolish for worrying. Maybe it was just an animal or something. But then I heard it again. The jiggling of the doorknob. It was slower now, like whoever was on the other side was being cautious, trying not to make too much noise. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I had to do something. I considered calling the police right then, but I didn't want to overreact. What if I was just imagining things? I didn't have much time to think about it. Suddenly, I heard a loud My heart stopped. I didn't know what had just happened. I couldn't process it fast enough. The back door, the one I had just checked, was broken. The glass in the window shattered in an instant, as if someone had just punched through it. I could hear the sound of the glass splintering, breaking into pieces, and scattering across the floor. It was like a violent explosion of sound, and I could see the sharp edges of the glass reflecting the dim light from the kitchen. In that split second, a hand, pale, bloodied, and jagged, shot through the hole where the glass had been. I could see the fingers, twisted and desperate, reaching through the broken window as if they were trying to grab something, anything inside. The hand moved slowly, deliberately, like it had all the time in the world, but I knew it didn't. Whoever was on the other side was coming for me. My breath caught in my throat, and panic hit me like a wave. I couldn't think. I didn't know what to do. I only knew I had to run. I turned and bolted without a second thought, my feet slamming against the hardwood floors, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I couldn't even hear my own breath. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my head, drowning out everything else. I slammed the door to my bedroom behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it, my fingers fumbling to twist the knob. I slid down the back of the door, trembling uncontrollably. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. I could still hear the sound of broken glass crunching in my mind, still feel the sensation of that hand reaching through the window like it was something from a nightmare. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed 911. My hands were shaking so much I could barely press the buttons. I finally got through, my voice cracking as I explained the situation. The dispatcher was calm, asking me questions I could barely answer. "Stay inside. Lock all doors and windows. The police are on their way." I didn't move. I stayed hidden, behind the bed, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I could feel the panic rising again, but I forced myself to stay still. The only thing I could do was wait. The sirens finally wailed in the distance, and I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding. The police arrived soon after, their flashing lights illuminating the outside of the house. I could hear them talking, their voices muffled by the walls. They checked the backyard, the broken window, but they didn't find anyone. The cops questioned me, of course. I told them everything, how I heard the doorknob rattling, how the glass shattered, how the hand came through, but they didn't seem as worried as I was. One officer even tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just some random break-in attempt. But something about their lack of urgency unsettled me. They didn't understand the sheer terror I felt. The police never found the person who had tried to break in. They couldn't even figure out how they had gotten away so quickly. It's been a few weeks now since that night, and I still can't shake the feeling. I still lock the back door every single time I'm home. I don't know who was out there or why they came for me, but I'll never forget that hand coming through the glass. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.